So this podcast has morphed into a large question of how do we make the world a better place? How do we heal things? How do we create more justice? How do we heal the environment? How do we heal ourselves and each other? How do we create a society that serves the people and the planet rather than just a few corporations and billionaires? And one of the guests who's had a big impact on me has been Richard Hodge. We did a 4-part series a while back, and his motto is no problem too big. And that's a challenge because when we're working in a specific area, let's say food deserts in the US or water pollution in the global South, it can seem like we're making no headway. Or when people are working on peace and reconciliation and a single terror attack or bombing or incursion can get everybody right back to the starting point of us against them, it can seem like all our problems are too big. And one of the things I really appreciated about the 4-part series with Richard is he lays out a systematic view, a systems view of the problem. So we're not just working in little silos, but we're working in our local areas with a cognizance of the big picture. And one of the things Richard advised me to do is to read a book called Less is More by Jason Hickel, which explains how the engine of almost all of the destructive policies in the world today are fueled by capitalism. And capitalism not as in let's have a market and let's sell things and buy things, but capitalism as defined as the goal is increased profits rather than increased utility, increased well-being for people and for society. And the book's author, Jason Hickel, makes an incredibly powerful argument, and I encourage everyone to read that, and I'll put a link in the show notes to today's episode. I reached out to Jason's team and found out that one of his colleagues who's done a lot of research and writing with him, Omer Tayyab, lives in Barcelona, not too far from me. So yesterday I made the trek, bicycle, train, walk, all the way to the Autonomous University of Barcelona, way up near Sabadell, which it turns out is a totally different town. So it took me quite a while to get there. And we sat down and we talked about capitalism, growth, degrowth, colonialism, imperialism, Zionism, environmentalism, and the way the global South and global North have been interacting in ways that are fueled by capitalism and are increasingly turning more and more and more of us into its victims rather than its beneficiaries. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. I hope to have more with Omer in the future. And I think it's going to be challenging, and it hopefully will also explain a few things. So without further ado, Omer Tayyab, welcome to the Plant Yourself podcast.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
And I want to thank you for your hospitality here. We are at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. What's the Catalan name?
The Autonomous University de Barcelona.
Okay, good.
And the institute, we're at this specific institute within the university. It's called ICTA, the Institute de Ciencia y Tecnología Ambiental, which translates to Institute of Environmental Science and Technology.
Okay, great. So before we get into it, I want to hear a little bit about you and what you study, and a little bit about your life history.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. So my name, as you said, my name is Omer Tayyab. I'm a researcher currently here at ICTA in ecological economics. Previously, I worked in Canada as an economist in various public service advisory roles. So I was an economist for the government of Alberta. I was also an economist for the government of Ontario. These are 2 provinces in Canada, for those of the listeners who don't know. And I was in a few different roles, ranging from macroeconomic and fiscal analysis to transportation analysis. And over the years of practicing, I started to observe the limits of more mainstream ways of thinking in economics. And I started to explore on myself some more of the heterodox economics ideas, which led me eventually, long process, but eventually it led me to the field of post-growth. and degrowth. So I was looking to sort of move in that direction professionally, and an opportunity came along here in Barcelona. So now I'm based here. So that's when I decided to move. My work is more focused on degrowth from a global south perspective. So degrowth has mainly been an idea that has come up in the global north, but it finds resonance with certain ideas in the global south too. So that's, I guess, where I come in. And one of the mainstreams of my work is to map out dependencies between global south and global north. So there's quite a bit of literature already on unequal exchange, on dependencies. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Okay, so a lot to define for my listeners, because it was a lot to define for me, and I found you through reading Jason Hickel's book,
Ah.
Less is More, and kind of an introduction for me to a lot of concepts, because I grew up thinking capitalism was the same as markets.
Right.
So let's start with global north, global south.
Right.
What do those mean?
Yeah. So if we look at the historical development process of capitalism, we see that there are certain countries where industrialization happened first. Those happen to be the same countries that were getting advantages of colonialism. These were mainly colonial powers. So I'm talking about countries like Britain, Netherlands. Eventually, it gets exported to the United States as well. What we see is that these were the countries that were able to develop industrially, and the other countries which were being exploited at the same time. So the larger Americas or India, or to some extent China. China was obviously not directly colonized, but it had sort of a colonial relationship with the rest of the West. We can think of it in those terms. So what we see is that industrialization happening and economic activity increasing in the global north in certain set of countries. Historically, those are the countries that we then call the global north, countries that continue to, let's say, dominate the global economic landscape, right? So think about an international institution like the G7, right? So which are the countries we see in the G7? It would be more the global. Those would be the countries that would get lumped together as the global north. Think of an institution like the IMF or the World Bank, right? Historically, what's been the case is that the World Bank top person, the head of that bank, has been a United States citizen, whereas for the IMF, it's been a resident of the EU, right? So it's really these two or three sets of countries, the United States, Europe, Japan, which have sort of controlled the global economy for large parts of, let's say, the previous century at least. I mean, it goes further back than that, but let's limit ourselves to the previous century for now. So those would be the countries which are economically more superior and are able to control the global economic landscape in terms of trade, in terms of their control of superior currencies. Like the world reserve currency is the United States dollar, right? It's not like, say, Indian rupee, for example, right? So that confers certain powers upon the United States, right, which other countries don't have. So this set of countries which are able to use their economic weight to control the global economy, we call the global north, and the countries that are left out, sort of, we call the global south.
Okay. It's not exactly north-south, but it's pretty close, right?
Yeah, no, it's not geographically as such. It's more like, I guess it's, back in the day, the term used to be third world, second world, first world. Now it's turned into more global south. So the idea is that there's some countries in the hierarchy that are at the top, some countries in the hierarchy that are at the bottom. So it's more global south, global north in that sense, rather than like an actual geography, right? Because otherwise, you can't really do that analysis geography.
Because I was familiar with first world, third world,
Right.
but when I started hearing global south, it was always in terms of a kind of a solidarity being offered or requested,
Right.
like that there is a system of power dynamics, and the people at the bottom are often fighting each other, and sort of this global south sort of was like, hey, we're all in this together.
Yeah.
There's a bigger system here. There's larger forces.
Exactly.
Okay, so then the next couple of words I wrote down that are going to be new to, were new to me until recently, guess let's which is think is more fun. Let's before we talk about post growth or degrowth, let's talk about growth.
Right.
Right. So you said you were an economist. You were working in a sort of mainstream. Can you just begin by explaining like the difference between having market economies and capitalism?
Right.
Like why is growth the word that is
Right.
sort of central to your shift?
Right. So there's two things, right? One is the like how do we define capitalism versus markets, and the other thing is like where does growth in this all of this come from, right? So think about for taking the first question. So capitalism and markets are two separate things because the the main difference that we look, I mean, there's certain avenues through which you can access this question. So I'm gonna start with one, which is what is the logic of production, right? When we do anything under capitalism, why are we doing it, right? So under capitalism, the main logic of production is production for profit, production for sale in the market, right? So the market becomes this like area which is controlling all other economic transactions, right? So let's say I am a food producer. So I'm not producing food for myself. I'm not producing food for my family or my larger community. There is this like larger world market where I need to produce for, and then I go and sell, and then whatever money I can make from that money, then I later on use to fulfill my needs or my family needs, and so on and so forth. So, but before capitalism, production used to happen, or at least mainly centered on need satisfaction, right? So people would produce. Let's say I was a smallholder farmer. I would produce for the needs of me and my family, and then if I had some excess left over, I would take to the market, and then I would sell, and then get something beneficial for myself in return. Whereas under capitalism, this logic is inverted, right? So now you're only producing for the market. You're only producing to what is called exchange value, right? You have something. It doesn't have its use value, quote unquote. So use value would be something that food provides you nourishment, right? That's the use value of it. The exchange value is something what you get from the market, the money you make out of it, right? So under capitalism, this is the key difference between capitalism and markets in general. Like, because markets have existed previous to capitalism, they will probably exist after capitalism. But under capitalism, the primacy of market is sort of a law, where any production that is happening to satisfy the needs of the market, not the needs of the people or the community.
So one objection that comes to mind is you mentioned your example was a small farmer. What if it was a small cobbler, right? They would not be making shoes,
Right.
right? They would still need to exchange.
Right.
So how is that different from
Right.
capitalism?
So again, under before previous to capitalism, people used to exist in these sort of smaller scale societies, right? It wasn't like huge urban centers that we live in today, right? So what would happen is that there would be a cobbler, there would be, let's say, a butcher, there would be a farmer who's growing food. So people would like utilize their skills and exchange their skills in satisfaction of needs of each other. So they would be still not producing just for themselves, but maybe for the community that they are involved in. And in that sense, you actually had personal relationships with the people, right? Because the same person who's providing you, let's say, grain year over year, you're providing the services for him or her year over year. So that forms a personal kind of relationship. Whereas under capitalism, it's all very impersonal, right? You go to a supermarket, you don't know who grew your food, who raised your chicken, who, whatever you happen to buy on that day. These personal relationships also got destroyed under capitalism. Right?
Gotcha. So profit became primary, but there was something else. So, and a lot of my questions are coming from reading Less is More by your colleague Jason Hickel, where the history I had been told was that capitalism was a natural outgrowth of feudalism, and the book argues against that, saying that feudalism was breaking down, that the poor, the peasants, the serfs were starting to feel their oats to take some power, and that capitalism was a repression of that. Can you kind of explain where capitalism came from?
Yes. So there's two like a couple of things here. So there was obviously when the feudal system existed, there were the classes that were the serfs, and the feudals used to profit off their labor, right? At the same time, within the feudal classes, you can say, or like separate to it, a new class of people was emerging, which was the capitalists, which was the sort of the early industrialists, you might call them. And these were the people who started doing production for, because science and technology was a little bit more advanced. It was possible to produce things, what we might call primitive machinery. Let's call it that. And so they were able to start producing. And then when they started, this group of people started to grow in economic power, and they wanted a more share in the political process as well. What they found was that the political power was completely concentrated in the feudal class, right? So this capitalist class was arising like slowly, and whereas the obviously the serfs were being oppressed by the feudal. So this capitalist class allied kind of with the serf class, and that was the process through which they could overthrow the power of the feudalists and themselves come into power, right? So it was the capitalist power replacing the feudal class, but the people who were at the bottom, they still remained in that bottom position, right? It wasn't that when capitalism came, it also emancipated the serfs, right? They just went from a being in a feudal position to being in a wage slave position, right? Like
What's the difference?
yeah, so the difference would be that under a feudal lord system, you would be bound like through law to a feudal lord, right? Like you live on their land, you whatever you produce, you give a certain amount of it to the feudal lord. Whereas under a capitalist system, people didn't have any access to any land of their own. All of that was taken away. Like there was a whole movement called the movement of enclosures, which enclosed commons. So commons would be areas where people could, let's say, could be a forest. People could go and hunt for game to, fulfill the nutritional needs of their families, right? These kinds of areas were privatized. And this is the movement of enclosures happens all across Europe. I think it starts in, I want to say in the 1400s. I might be a bit off on that. But it happens so that people who could access certain areas to fulfill their needs, those areas became off limits to them, right? So they had only their labor to sell and nothing else. They could not use their labor for their own needs. They had to utilize their labor. They had to sell their labor so that one of the capitalist people could give them access to the basic needs of life. So that was the key.
So here he echoes in sort of today's, the economy I grew up in, which we have total freedom and liberty. Like I can do, we can become anything. I can do whatever I want. I'm remembering the quote that I heard somewhere in college: is that both the rich man and the poor man have the right to sleep under a bridge at night.
That's simple.
Right. So we're saying it's essentially non-slave slavery because
Exactly.
there's no choice. There's still no choice.
I mean, the system puts you in a place where you have only a limited set of choices. Like, if you look at it more naively, you can say, well, a person has a choice to start a business. But think about if you are living like paycheck to paycheck, if you don't have access to, let's say, even banking services, who's gonna help you, or who's gonna provide you the capital to even start a business, let alone having the education or the ideas to and the freedom of mind to even think about a business and then start it, right? So it's like certain class of people are always placed in this oppressed position where they're just constantly fighting for survival, and that's exactly it, right? You have the freedom of choice to sleep under the bridge.
So, but there's a lot more to capitalism than, because there's always been sort of rich people oppressing poor people. Like that's capitalists didn't invent that. What were some of the sort of the philosophical and religious ideas that led to capitalism, which turns into this metastatic growth problem?
Right. So the growth problem, I think, is actually, I did not address that. So maybe we should probably talk about growth first, and then we can tackle the philosophical
Great.
sort of developments that happen along.
That makes sense.
Right. So under capitalism, we have to think about how it organizes certain units in relation to each other. Right. So there's a discipline called systems thinking and system dynamics. What it does is that it looks at a whole system, whatever it is looking to analyze, and rather than thinking about how the individual parts perform, it looks at the interrelationships between those units, and then it tries to figure out what kind of properties are those relationships giving rise. So this is not very abstract. I'm going to give you an example. Um, when we start to study capitalism in this way, like we're not interested in what the individual consumer is doing or what the individual firm is doing, but we rather start looking at interrelationships between the different economic agents and where there are tensions and even possibilities of alliances. That's what kind of gives us this idea where growth comes from. So again, now getting down to more concrete bits, think about the relationship between workers and the capitalists, right? So that relationship is inherently in contradiction to each other, right? Let's say a group of people, or let's say a factory, a group of workers and a capitalist owner, they come together, they produce like some kind of surplus, right? Let's say they're producing, I don't know, let's say iPhones. And then they, at the end of the transaction, they are left with the surplus. Now, this surplus has to be distributed, right? There has to be some kind of mechanism to distribute that. So how does that happen? Now, the workers obviously want most of the surplus for themselves. The capitalist wants most of the surplus to themselves. So this inherently creates this kind of contradiction between the two parties, right? And so now you scale that up to an economy level, and you see that wherever there are capitalists and wherever there are workers, their interests will always be colliding. So one way of avoiding or deferring this conflict is through growth, right? Let's say a company produces a certain amount of profit in 1 year, and if there's a conflict over this distribution, what you can do is you can promise the workers, well, next year we're going to sell 20% more, and then we'll have more profit, and then we'll be able to meet your needs, right? And then so on and so forth. Every year you kind of go on this growth treadmill where you're deferring the conflict between distribution by promising future growth, right? And that happens at the economy level too, right? When we think about like many austerity-driven policies, like, let's do tax cuts now for the rich, and we will cut, let's say in Medicare or some kind of other medicinal services, healthcare services. What the promise is that, well, all of this will eventually lead to some kind of growth that will be beneficial to everybody, right? That's the argument that's given. So this is where also a drive for growth in capitalism comes from, to avoid those conflicts that exist between workers and capitalists. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, so again, wouldn't that happen for the cobbler who hires an apprentice? Wouldn't there still be that inherent conflict?
Yeah, but again, we were talking about production that is happening primarily to serve the market's needs, right? There's no like top on there, right? You can sell as much as you want. Whereas with the cobbler, with the apprentice, there are certain needs in the economy that once they're met, they don't need to really engage in production, right? And that's just one example, right? The worker and capitalist contradiction. But there's also conflict between capitalists, right? Because remember that under capitalism, different companies in the same industry are engaged in a competitive relationship, right? So one of the ways to beat the competition is to use economies of scale, right? So if my firm grows rather quickly and I achieve economies of scale, let's say I have bigger, better machineries that can produce things at a faster rate than my competitor, and my staff becomes more productive. That way I can beat the competition, right? So the drive to grow for individual firms then also becomes a way for them to get a competitive advantage, right? And then Wall Street also comes into it, right? Like, let's say you want to grow fast because a competitor could grow faster too. You access, let's say, financial markets, and then financial markets say, yeah, we're going to invest in you, but we're going to need X amount of return from this investment, right? So where does that return come from? That return comes from, obviously, from more growth, right? So you have to sell more product so that your revenues can grow, and then you can pay off the Wall Street investors and so on and so forth. So so there are all these kinds of many different kinds of these drives and imperatives that exist within capitalism, which lead it to depend on growth. Otherwise, if growth stops happening, then capitalism itself can collapse, like into a societal disorder. Like, think about what happens when growth becomes, God forbid, negative, right? We call it a recession, right? And it leads to all manner of social ills, right? Like later bankruptcies, there are mortgage delinquencies, there are massive job losses. So there are all these kinds of things that start to happen once growth stops, right? Or growth goes negative. which also again shows us that how dependent capitalism is on growth.
There's a journalist in the U.S. I follow named Matt Stoller.
You read a newsletter, I think.
About monopolies. And he's been talking a lot about this idea of number go up, right? That sort of the only thing that matters for politics, for the economy, for society, is that the stock market goes up.
And you might remember that during COVID, when people's health was at risk, and there was it was a really socially anxious time for everybody, right? Stock market was going up.
Right.
Because the tech companies were making a lot of money because everything was moving online, right? And the way the U.S. Stock market is structured now, it's like very heavily dominated by the tech sector, particularly the NASDAQ, less so the S&P 500, but the NASDAQ more so. And you saw that those stock indexes were doing really. So that also tells you that how capitalism becomes kind of detached from this needs of the people, right? Which it is supposed to serve, right? An economic system is supposed to serve the needs of the population, not the other way around. Right?
Yeah, well, I come from a health background, and so when I started looking at the economics of healthcare, I realized like when McDonald's sells hamburgers that people eat, GDP goes up,
Right.
and when those people need coronary bypasses because of the beef, it goes up.
GDP goes up, yeah.
So it was clear that something is being served other than the needs of the people.
Exactly.
But it doesn't, like I grew up in a world where like it's still the best system. I remember my father, who was he was a Trotskyite in his youth, and an ardent, labor leader. He said capitalism is, I think he was quoting maybe Winston Churchill, capitalism is the worst system in the world except for all the others. So it never occurred to me that there were alternatives. But so starting to read Less is More, the book begins with the precipitous decline in insect populations. It promises to draw a line between capitalism and this collapse. Whereas, I grew up thinking, well, there's always going to be problems to solve, but we're on a progressive trajectory. Society will solve problems, inventors will create new things. And Less is More kind of like punched that theory in the face. Can you talk about what the issue is with endless growth?
Right. So the main issue with endless growth is that it doesn't materialize out of nowhere, right? We actually need to access nature and resources to power that growth, right? So it could be just fossil fuels, but even other things, right? For example, think about the war over rare earth minerals that is happening right now. It's become a big geopolitical issue between the US and China, right? Because rare earth magnets go into these very high-end computer chips. And because both China and US want to be at the technological forefront, it's become a point of contention between those two countries, right? So again, this is just one example to show that the growth that we're thinking about, it doesn't just materialize out of nowhere. It actually needs things that are dug out of the ground or somewhere exploited for the growth to happen. So a very good example of that is industrial food production, right? So the way industrial food production, particularly in the US, happens is that we have these large, acres and acres of land where there's like 2 or 3 crops growing at the maximum, right? It's like, soybean or sugarcane or corn or, a few crops that are profitable to produce. But what the industrial production system means is that because there's a lot of usage of pesticides, there's a lot of usage of fertilizers, what happens is that it degrades the quality of the soil on which the crops are being grown. So over time, like 20, 50 years, the land starts to become barren. And then you need to expand your agricultural footprint more and more, right? And what do? You expand into forests. You clear out forests, right? Because that's where the good, quote unquote, land is for future production. And that means lessening biodiversity. And so you were talking about the declining insect population, right? That is a direct impact or one of the major drivers of that declining population is actually our industrial food production system. Because we have to continually expand our agricultural footprint, it means there's less space for non-human creatures to survive, and that is, and again with the uses of more and more pesticides, which kills all the other creatures. Fertilizers that then get run off because once rain comes, all the excess fertilizer gets driven down to seas and oceans, which creates this large what are called algal blooms. So fungi. There's only like algae that can survive in that in that environment. So all the fish die. So it creates this sort of what's the word, chain reaction, which leads to death and destruction across all other ecosystems, right?
So like people have been talking about this probably seriously since the 1970s, and there was a huge strain that I was finding convincing for a while, or that the issue is not capitalism, it's global population, that there were just too many humans, and we needed to cut down on human population growth. The more I read into it, the more it started seeming like eugenic.
A lot of it comes from eugenics, yes.
So like which are the people who get to survive and reproduce, the global north again.
Yeah.
But it's a reasonable argument on its surface that the human pressure on the planet is caused because of too many humans, not because of how we're structuring our economy. What's the response to that?
Yeah, I think my response to that is that when we take this framing, we are automatically thinking, well, presence of humans must mean something detrimental to the planet. That has not been the case historically, particularly if we learn from native populations in the US, indigenous population in the US and Canada and larger Americas. Their philosophy always used to be that we will leave this land better off than we found it. So the way they existed, the way they lived, and we see this in the historical record that biodiversity increased while they were, stewarding that land. Soil fertility actually was increasing during that. The way they practiced something called agroforestry or agroecology was actually beneficial to the environment. So agroecology is something that focuses on ecological intensification rather than chemical intensification, right? So it looks at different patterns of, let's say, different species that go well together. And then it utilizes the symbiosis between different species, like not just plant varieties, but also insects and birds that can then feed on those insects. It uses all of this ecological insight and tries to produce food in a way which is ecologically more aligned. So, and coming back to the original point, that the way they left and the way they stewarded the land was such that it was actually improving the like I don't know if you know about the bison runs, which are quite famous for increasing soil carbon levels in the soil and soil fertility in the U.S. plains, which had made these areas so very fertile that when the settlers came in and they started doing their own methods of agricultural production, they found like them to be immensely productive, these areas, right? And it was all down to the work that generation upon generation, hundreds of years of native people's work had gone into that, right? So it's not that humanity is coming back to the framing point, that it's not that the human existence has to be in such a way that it necessarily creates some kind of pressures on the environment, and it can actually be beneficial to the environment. We just haven't seen that way of living for a long period of time. We see ourselves in these, highly urbanized, industrialized environments, which necessarily mean that there's a lot of waste that is created that then has to be taken care of. And so we naturally think that, well, this is the only way we can exist, right? But this is not the only way we can exist. And people actually, for hundreds of thousands of years, have existed in societies which were much more kind to the environment and which were actually beneficial for the environment.
Mm-hmm. Then you have like historians like Yuval Noah Harari, who does look back, who acknowledges that there were those times, but tells us kind of an inevitabilist story that was less efficient, right? That somebody who figured out how to grow agriculture was that their population was naturally going to expand, and then they would have to colonize, and I know that to his credit, Harari like like I think he may have read less more and said, "Oh, you've changed my mind on some things."
Yeah, I didn't know that.
Oh, no. You know what it was? It was he changed his mind around The Dawn of Everything, David Graeber and David Wengrow. But I think they're sort of buddies,
and the same
intellectual buddies.
Yeah.
But what it's such a good story. And of course, it's a story that Silicon Valley
Right.
embraced and turned him into the chief intellectual historian of our time, because it supports that narrative.
Right.
But he does have a point that there were fewer people
Right.
back then.
Right.
So is this, explosive population growth a result of capitalism, or?
I mean, the increase in in population is more so associated with the increase in agricultural techniques and agriculturalization, sure. But again, the question is maybe the way under capitalism populations have sort of exploded is very unsustainable itself, right? Because much of it is predicated on something called the green revolution, right? In the food production arena, where there is lots of fertilizers and pesticides have been utilized to create like a few food crops that can feed the population. So perhaps the way the populations were growing at a slower rate was a more natural state of being, versus this like hyper growth mode. We have to have more and more food all the time, so just so they can feed the populations that we are bringing into the world. So I think it's looking at just the high growth in population as like some kind of a net positive on its own. I don't really buy that, right? Like, I mean, population growth could be good in some cases, it could be not so good in some cases. Like, we don't know, right? What is kind of the natural way of being, right? So how I would look at it is that if a society is living within its planetary limits, it's living within its ecological limits, and actually living in a way that is aligned with the local flora and fauna, then whatever the population growth rate is, that's probably the natural way of being. And we do studies actually now that when people attain a certain level of material comfort, the population growth rate kind of stabilizes. Like, it just kind of ends up at this replacement rate, right? So the number of new people that are being born are roughly equal to the people who die, which kind of takes you to a steady state.
So I was reading in Matt Kennard's book, The Racket. He says, like, the one growth curve we know how to control is human population, right, through maternal and infant health, essentially.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Right. So that when things get better is when populations
kind of stabilize.
Yeah. So let's go back to this like the doomsday scenario that so scared and convinced me about that capitalism cannot exist without growing. Right. The minute a company doesn't grow, its stock plummets, it lays off people, there's immiseration. When a country doesn't grow, that happens en masse. We get international capital withdraws, or a military comes in and so looks at countries that are poor and sees them as potential sweatshops to lower wages. So what, like, again, growing up in a liberal, we have to reform capitalism sort of in a Keynesian way. Like, we have to, right? And I spent many years as a sort of industrial leadership coach, and I'm starting to realize that so much of my work has been sort of massaging the edges of an inherent conflict. Right. So management, how do we be nice to workers? How do we empower them in honestly meaningless ways when they
have a ping pong table instead of a
or even teams that can converse, like, where there's like good communication, and so everyone's happy to be there. There's still these imbalances that leads to from a systems perspective, we don't really have a choice. We have to consume the world. And then the minute we stop consuming the world, the minute we stop exploiting people from the global south, the minute we stop extracting natural resources, the minute we release our dominion, right, that we let countries choose their own democratic leaders, things go to hell, and then we have to assassinate people through the programs or
exactly. That's 100% it.
So now you're talking about degrowth and post-growth.
Right.
What is that, and how is it possible?
Right. So degrowth, how we define it is that it's a transition process where we leave capitalism in the past and we move towards a world where we are not, our social systems are not dependent on growth to survive. That is the main crux of what degrowth is. And how it achieves that is it looks at the current material and energy usage in the world, like however much we dig up and then whatever waste we're creating, it looks at that. And it says that there needs to be an equitable reduction, right? Because obviously, equitable is important here because not all peoples of the world are using resources in the same manner, right? Those of us who are living in the global south live in much more energy intensive and material intensive ways, right?
We north.
Yeah. Those of us in the global north, right? Like say coming from the US, Canada, Spain, whatever, right? But like let's say a farmer living in India is obviously not using resources to that amount, right? So what degrowth calls for is then a planned reduction in the material energy usage, focus obviously mainly on the global north, right? Because that's where the overconsumption is happening. And through that transition and through a process of economic democracy, so I think I'll get back to the economic democracy bit a bit in a bit. But through this process, what we end up is with a new logic of production, right? I think I have an article on that too, which with that very title, Degrowth, a New Logic of Production. Like I said, in the capitalism definition, the logic of production is production for the market, right, for profit. Whereas under degrowth, a degrowth transition, production starts happening for need satisfaction, right? So there actually might be increases in some things. Degrowth doesn't mean just like an overall reduction, because that would be just a recession, right? So what we want is increases in nutritious food, for example. So transitioning away from industrial food production to ecological food production, right? What we want is an increase in healthcare services, particularly, right? And again, healthcare services that are more ecologically delivered rather than the current kind of industrial or pharmacological way of doing medicine. So we might want increases in public transportation systems, right? Because particularly like a country like the US and also my experience in Canada, you must have seen the suburbs that are so car dependent, right? Once you move to some place like Barcelona, you realize actually I can, if a public transportation system is there, I'm better off without a car in many cases, right? So yeah, in these areas we want an increase, and then we want some decreases in areas like fast fashion, for example, or we know about industries like the tech industry, which practices something called planned obsolescence, where they make devices work poorer after a couple of years through software upgrades and whatnots. We want, no production of luxury yachts or private planes or stuff like that, right? Because that is still material that is coming up from the ground somewhere and then being built into this thing, which is really not helping anybody meet their needs, right? It's just maybe stroking the ego of some billionaire, but it's not really meeting a crucial need for the people. So that's the idea behind degrowth.
Mm-hmm. And so when you talk about, this is like billionaires tend to control the economy. They control the media.
Right.
It's not even a secret anymore. But is that where economic democracy comes in? Because there's an old Jewish fable about a rabbi who wakes up with a dream that he's going to solve the world's problems because the rich are going to share their money with the poor. And he goes off on a mission, and the joke is he comes back after many years. The students say, "How's it going?" Rabbi says, "I'm halfway there. The poor have agreed."
That's a weird fable. I'll remember this much. But yeah, sorry. So yeah, you're exactly right. This is where the economic democracy bit comes in, because when we say economic democracy, we mean that where should our productive abilities go, right? Right now, it's just a few people, few capitalists, few rich guys at the top who decide, well, I want to build a rocket because I'm going to shoot it off into space because that, I don't know, maybe I have an insecurity somewhere which I need to address in this manner. But yeah, so like you can have billionaires building, space rockets and all these kinds of things, whereas people literally die of hunger in the world, right? So at the same time, this is happening. So when we talk about economic democracy, we mean that, well, we all come together to produce the economy, produce the things that we do. How about we also have a say in what we get to build, right? So it's just about having actual normal people, workers, who produce the value that they do, and decide where that value should be produced. Like, do we want to build more arms and ammunitions, or do we want to build more hospitals, right? Do we want to build more, faster and faster sports cars, or do we want to build more public transportation? So it's these kinds of decisions, and particularly decisions around investment. Where does the surplus that we've saved from previous generation, where does that go, right? How do we, what are the capacities that we need to develop, and what are the capacities that we don't really care about? So that's the economic democracy bit that I referred to. Yeah.
Right. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I want to go in two completely different directions. Maybe I could come back and we could have a second
I would love to have it back.
conversation, because I do want to talk about oppression in the global South, and specifically, I would like you to challenge the Zionism I grew up with, which was a beautiful story about, that turns out to have completely fallen apart.
All right.
My children helped open my eyes after Gaza, but it's hard for me to imagine anyone seeing what's happening in Gaza and believing the story I grew up with.
Right.
Which I think is directly related to capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd like to let's put, I'm putting a stake in the ground. Like, that's, I don't want to skirt that issue, because it's becoming very important to me.
Of course.
But I want to end with some sort of hope or direction. Like, where is this happening anywhere in the world, other than sort of left progressive think tanks?
You mean like degrowth? Is degrowth happening? Yeah, I mean, honestly, you mentioned the Gaza genocide. I think challenges to imperialism, capitalist imperialism, like that, because I think we didn't get into it, but maybe in a next iteration we can get into how capitalism and imperialism are basically two faces of the same global system. I think what Gaza and what Palestinians do is provide a very robust colonial challenge or decolonial challenge to this system, right? Because they refuse to leave their land and let it be utilized for the Zionist project. So I think, like, I would actually look at Gaza and the resistance that is happening there, and I that's also, I think, something that I would be very wary of saying, that we must support the resistance, because we might not agree with everything that they have to say, but the point is that these are the people who are resisting the global capitalist imperialist system with basically no resources, right? So it's very important to highlight that fact. And in other places, we can think about small. We have a group at ICTA which does a lot of research in something we call real existing degrowth, which is the question you're asking. And I think recently the handbook of degrowth was published, where there is a chapter on real existing degrowth. So if people are more interested, they can try to access that book. The book was called The Handbook of Degrowth.
I'll try to find it and link it in the show notes.
Thank you. And so it has a chapter on real existing degrowth. And what we look at here, because it's mostly Greek researchers, and Greece's geography is such that it kind of lends itself to these degrowth ideas much more than, let's say, a place like, let's say, New York City or something else. Because there's many small, tiny islands which can be self-sustained, which have historically been self-sustaining, right? So over there, the researchers tried to learn from those small communities how they do production for need satisfaction instead of just, like, again, producing for the market, and how there are new projects that have come online, let's say, for renewable energy production, for more agroecological food production, because the climate is changing. So some climate resilience work that has happened there. So they look at those small communities. There's some in, I think we're currently doing the work on Ikaria, one of the islands, but there's other islands too in Greece, which have these sort of learnings which we can take. And I think the agroecological kind of movement of movements, which is named Via Campesina. I don't know if you're familiar with it. So Via Campesina is this sort of peasant-based organization which advocates for smallholder farming, agroecological farming, commons-based land organization. So no private ownership of single plots of land that can be used for like capitalist profiteering. For it is actually the movement which coined the concept of food sovereignty as opposed to food security, which is more of a Western concept. And so they're doing pretty amazing work in terms of I mean, they wouldn't call themselves obviously Degrowth because this is a movement that is largely based in the global south. But the ideas you will find in Via Campesina are very basically the same ideas as you would find in Degrowth, in spirit at least. Right. So there are all these um, movements and organizations that are trying to do work that could challenge capitalism at its core.
Yeah, when you mentioned like the difference between Greek islands and New York City, you think, well, people in New York City benefit from the current system, but they don't. Like there was an article today in this morning's New York Times around, they asked climate risk group to model a superstorm, like that includes like superstorm Sandy with extra rain. When is it like, first of all, New York City is going to become an island again because the bridges are going to collapse. Half of the city is going to be underwater. Like the global north with all our technology are just a couple of shakes of Mother Nature's tail away from being extremely unself-sufficient.
That is true. That is very true. I mean, all these sort of large urban centers they don't realize how dependent they are on production that is going on around the world, right? Like, and COVID kind of showed a little bit of picture of that, right? When the supply chains shut down, you saw like you couldn't have, in many areas, couldn't have basic needs services or basic needs goods being delivered. So we do sort of should have gotten some ideas, but after the COVID experience, I feel like we're now on our way to sort of forgetting that the pandemic has passed, even though it hasn't passed, right? COVID cases are still happening daily. But unfortunately, I suppose the media is so very much capitalist owned that they're not really interested in challenging the status quo in any way. So, people like us have to find these alternative ways of getting the ideas across.
Yeah, I think it's very hard for us within the conversation that we've always been in to see outside it. So I'm looking to people from the global south. One of my favorite authors is the Australian researcher Tyson Yunkaporta, who writes about Western civilization from an indigenous Australian perspective, and it's such a different story, right? The United States is the kind of beacon of democracy around the world and bringing civilization. And yeah, we do some things wrong, but
no, yeah, it's a story that is told to propagandize the world. I mean, that's kind of the story that all empires tell, right? All empires tell that, oh, we are just like these beneficent, munificent, stewards of the global economy, and we'll come in your country and we'll make your lives better. And obviously, it's all just a facade to continue extraction that has always been going on. And you've mentioned like how the U.S. carries out different coups and assassinations around the world, and not only just that, it actually facilitates the cultivation of local elites, which are sort of indebted to the U.S. system, so they kind of control their so quote unquote restive populations on the U.S.'s behalf or the global system's behalf, right? So all of this stuff happens, and people who've come from the global south, like myself, like I grew up in Pakistan, so we kind of saw the first hand of it, how these things happen. Because I remember back in, I think it was 2008 when Condoleezza Rice's like book came out, and she was talking about, I arranged the meeting between the dictator in Pakistan and the political leaders in Pakistan to come to a compromise. And you're reading that stuff and you were saying, why are you so involved in my issues, right? Another country, and that kind of gives us that idea. But people who are in the empire, within the core, like maybe you grew up within the U.S., right? So it's much harder to see those things.
Yeah. Well, I was reading about there was a negotiation where the U.S. wanted to put a military base in Honduras, and the Honduran president said, "Okay, as long as I can put one in Miami."
Yes.
You realize, like, why isn't that reasonable?
Exactly. US is the only country, I think, which has like 800 bases dotted all over the global map, right? I mean, it has bases in Germany, in Japan, in South. I mean, basically, I can go on and on with how the imperial system works. But yeah. Of course, the military is a very important part of managing the empire.
Right. And I think what we're getting to, with in addition to the limits of growth, which we're seeing in superstorms, in pandemics, in societal breakdown, we're also seeing the most people in the U.S., arguably the center of empire, are also its victims at this point.
Of course, of course.
So, and and like you said, all these different, like Via Campesina and the farmers and I think any philosophy or group that seeks to live in harmony with nature is aligned with degrowth.
With degrowth, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I would say that degrowth is just the sort of European or global north manifestation of the same ideas that exist across humanity. So Via Campesina, they might name it a different thing and the specificities might differ a little bit, but essentially the spirit is the same for degrowth, for Via Campesina, for movements like Ubuntu in Africa, the concept of ecological civilization in China. I think these are all coming from the same place, which is like deep down common within the human spirit, right?
Yeah, and I think people are terrified by degrowth,
Right.
right? But the more I read about it, the more it's like can't remember where I stole this phrase, but it's genuine abundance rather than manufactured scarcity.
Right.
Right. So we imagine living in a world in which everyone gets their needs met,
Yeah,
and I don't need a lock on my door.
of course. I mean, yeah, that's how the capitalist system works, right? It will create these kinds of extra needs by individualizing and atomizing the people, whereas we should be more aware that if we are collectively pursuing our well-being as a collective, then that just frees us up from so many other so many other ways of kind of where we become insecure, right? Like if we have a collective food production system, we can basically meet everybody's needs, but we have food, we put it behind a paywall called the grocery store, and then people who don't have the money, they can't even access the food is there. They can technically go and just eat it. But the way capitalist system works is unfortunately that it puts these barriers in the middle.
So with the promise that we can come back and talk about capitalism and imperialism,
Right.
Let's end. How can people find out more, follow you, follow your work?
Yeah, thanks. So I write a little bit in popular media from time to time. So I guess I don't really have one particular platform which I could think of, but I am on LinkedIn, for example. You can find me on there. If you search for my name, it'll pop up. I have a Twitter account also, which I'm not super active on, but I think I'll start getting more active on it sooner rather than later. It's at @OT_eco, which means Omer Tayyab ecological economics. And
Okay, I'll link to those in the show notes. And if you have some compendium of some articles that you want to send to me, I can post them as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned one of the articles, Degrowth, the New Logic of Economic Production. I'll send you that. If people are more interested in learning about the capitalist imperialist link, with Jason Hickel, I co-wrote this article on Al Jazeera. It's on the impact of sanctions on human health and human well-being.
I just saw that. We've killed 38 million people.
Yes, exactly.
With strategic sanctions to punish countries that don't do what we want.
Precisely. So there's that article, and you mentioned Jason's book, Less is More, is a good introduction to degrowth. And again, coming back to the capitalist imperialist framing, Jason's other book, The Divide, is also a good read on this topic. So I would highly recommend that.
Fantastic. Omer, thank you so much for taking the time for explaining things so well and for the work you do in the world. That gives me hope.
Thanks. I would thank you for giving me the time to explain these concepts, and I hope people find it useful. Thanks.
And that's a wrap. You can find the show notes with links to the books and other resources we talked about at plantyourself.com/629. So movement news, back to harder cardio workouts on the beach. My legs appear to have healed from a lot of the traumas of the summer. So Jay has got me doing more sprints. Got a couple of on sale jump ropes at Decathlon, and so I'm back to doing some sets of those, along with trying to get my push-ups back up to 100 a day. The other day, I think I managed about 70 before I maxed out before the end of the hour. And I'm thinking of getting a gravel bike. I didn't know what that was, but apparently it's a hybrid between a mountain bike and a road bike. And a friend of mine has a bike touring company. He's selling some of his old stock, so I can get a pretty nice Italian gravel bike for a discount. And I originally wanted it just because the two crappy folding bikes that I got for 90 euros each 2 years ago are just getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm starting to have to push them up hills. And I'm starting to be embarrassed about that. And this bike should be able to get me to town and back. I've been resisting because it's so common to have bicycles stolen here. But I'm also thinking, like, it doesn't look that great. And it would give me the opportunity to go further afield. There's lots of trails apparently near where I live, and some of them even go to up into the mountains or to nearby towns like Villanova. And so I'm thinking of splurging on a better bicycle than I've ever owned for the purpose of starting to take longer trips, which I think would be probably better than jogging on asphalt for my knees, and still interesting and a good workout, especially going up hills. Aside from that, Ultimate has been going apace. There's a couple of tournaments coming up in the winter here, beach tournaments, and then there's, I think in March, finally another grass tournament. So hopefully my joints will all have healed by then. The other big thing I'm looking to do this year in terms of movement is to develop more flexibility. And I've tried a bunch of stuff. I've tried stretching programs. I've been watching YouTube videos on, my nervous system being the limiting factor. So far, nothing has quite worked, but I continue to explore. If you have any ideas about how I can start to touch my toes, and especially putting on my right sock and shoe have become a real problem. And I'm 60 now, and I can just picture 65, 70, 75, if I make it that long, being increasingly creaky and not wanting that to happen. So looking for a daily or weekly practice that can get me more supple. So that's what's going on with me. Back next time with another fascinating interview. I have one in the can that I've been waiting to release about sociocracy, which you may not have heard of. I hadn't really heard of it until I met the person, Sheila Meyerson, who is one of the consultants with the sociocracy group. But basically, it's a way of putting people together in groups that is better than autocracy and arguably better than democracy. So it's a way of actually empowering people rather than just pitting two groups against each other to see who can get the most votes. So look forward to sharing that with you. In the meantime, as always, be well, my friends.